So this is kind of, by comparison to a lot of the things we saw earlier today, the real data nerd side of this. We're going to be talking about the impact of mobile broadband on mobile video, which I think is probably a great topic considering the audience that we've got here. Why is that important? Well, because more and more traffic is going mobile, whether it's 3G, Wi-Fi, or 4G, and depending on the place you are in the world, there's a wide range of these technologies available. You can see how what Cisco has forecast in terms of growth. If it's a little hard to read, what it's saying is there's 57% compound annual growth rate in terms of exabytes per month, rising from 2.5 exabytes in 2014 to a forecast of 24.3 exabytes. And of that, mobile video will generate 69% of mobile data traffic by 2019. And I think what that speaks to is the fact that there's such a significant demographic that is essentially mobile first. Video News, Richmond's site just published something really interesting this morning in terms of broadband connections. I believe it was for the US. There was actually a loss in terms of connectivity, a loss of 30,000 compared with a gain of 270,000 a year before. So that's a big swing in people just cutting the cord. And as the father of a millennial, I know that there is a whole generation out there that does view the iPad as a big screen TV compared to their phones. So there is a demographic that expects to be able to get this whenever, wherever. We've talked about that in a number of the sessions this morning. We wrote a piece on why the network sucks at 5 o'clock. And really it all has to get back to quality of delivery. So if you're trying to monetize content, why should you care about this? I mean, there's an intuitive reason, but there are also some great studies that have been done. Coviva's published some great data. Akamai's got really great data that they did with Ericsson around this, and a number of academic studies that have been done as well. So your users will abandon your app for rich media. If there's more than a 10-second delay in time to start, 18% of your users will have abandoned at that point. Now, that is a much more straight line than traditional wireline desktop type access. There's much lower patience, but what the trend has been is that is getting closer and closer to wireline. The expectations are going up as the technology improves. Buffering of 1% of your video will reduce viewing time by 11 minutes. Conversely, viewers will watch twice as much content if it's delivered in high definition. Coviva's got some great statistics on that. But mobile broadband, those three technologies, both cellular and Wi-Fi, really do conspire to make life difficult. Not all the time, but often enough as it turns out. And we're going to look at some of the data that actually drives that. So you don't want buffering. You want to ensure really good real-time performance. You want to keep it in high definition as long as possible because that will enhance the experience. The users are starting to expect that. So let me explain how Quicker has done some of the analysis that you're going to see. So we have what we call a mobile delivery network as exemplified by the big cloud with our logo in it. Essentially what we have is a bookended service with a proprietary protocol. You integrate our technology into your mobile app. It goes onto the device. You use our SDK to get it on there. And then that is used to connect to our cloud. And we want to be connected basically to the point where content is delivered. Most typically with our customers, it's a CDN. Many increasingly are also using cloud directly, or there's components of both. And occasionally some are just going straight to their data centers. We see all models and sometimes hybrids of those models. But essentially what we're doing is because we are on the mobile device itself, as well as a point in the cloud when we're handing it off to how the content is being served, and we're looking at traffic going both directions, whether we're accelerating or not, we actually have a huge database of everything that's happening. When I joined the company about 4 months ago, we were talking about, well, do we need to limit the amount of data that we're gathering? And we made a decision. We have no idea what we're going to do with all of this stuff, but we're going to keep it all because we don't know what we don't know yet about what's happening. We want to be able to have the granularity to be able to look at this over time. And most critically, we want to be able to look at it in a very granular way. And I took advantage of some of that capability, as you'll see as I go through the presentation, kind of going from very high worldwide levels down to, we'll actually look at the impact on an individual video stream in this. But so we have access to all of this data. I do want to mention that this is actually a slice of what is actually going to be in a benchmarking study that we're going to publish in June. The very last slide, I'll put up a URL if you're interested in getting a copy of it as soon as it's available. All you have to do is go in there, register. We'll just send you an email as soon as the study is available. But what we want to be able to do is characterize what the impact is of mobile broadband performance on mobile apps. All right, so we've got a lot of the data to do that. And today what I wanted to focus in, because of the limited amount of time, and because fundamentally we're down into really in the weeds in a lot of this stuff sometimes, is really two of the concepts that are very intimately linked and interdependent with each other, which is throughput and packet loss. Those vary widely based on time of day, type of device, network type, but most importantly, geographic locations, as what we've seen. So we'll actually drill into some of that. What we also want to do is start to put some concepts out in terms of how do you actually measure this? What is statistically significant? When you're dealing with the kind of thing we're doing, we have a number of apps that we test apps that we run on our network. We're gathering controlled data on about 1 million sessions a day on these controlled apps across our network from almost every country in the world. When you think about trying to deliver video, and that was what the topic is supposed to be today, but it really applies to any streaming content. You've got to look and say, we did a piece that we call the app poverty level. At what point do you take a step down? So, if you want to get to high def, you've got to be able to consistently deliver right at around 5 meg. You start dropping below that, adaptive bitrate will step you down. And I like the idea that some of our customers have had is that the lowest resolution is audio only. You don't want the customer to think that the app is stalled. That's the kiss of death, because then they'll start poking at it. We've seen that with some of our test apps that we had to basically invoke the same thing. So how likely is it that you can meet those standards? So we really look at 3 statistical measurements. What's the mean throughput? What's the standard deviation of that? How spread out is that? And then what's the coefficient of variation? What is kind of essentially what we're trying to do is give some indication on what we've started to think of as in terms of bandwidth volatility, right? And the problem with mobile is it's not like wireline at all. Wireline, generally, once you have your throughput, it pretty much stays at that. The problem with any wireless technology is they're generally shared media, right? More people come on, try to use the network, it's contention. Conditions change, you get interference, the user is actually moving around, getting in and out of range. All of those things conspire to make life more difficult. And the problem with just using standard TCP is that as that degrades, there's a much higher likelihood of packet loss, which then in turn gets you into a cycle where everything steps down in terms of throughput. TCP thinks that there's a bottleneck somewhere in there and is trying to find its new equilibrium. And that becomes really difficult. One of the first slices we did of this data was for a prospective customer that is using a video on demand app. It's actually a sports app, so it's all this pre-recorded video around sports, news conferences, player interviews, things like that. So they're generally trying to run 5 to 20-minute pieces on this. So we did a pretty controlled test for them. So we have some really interesting statistics out of that. So I'm going to use it as an example of the variability. So the average session length was right around 10 minutes. This was a control test, so we wanted to try to control for that. The average bandwidth that they saw was 2.847 megabits per second. So pretty close to getting to 720p consistently. However, we saw a huge variability. The min was 1.165 average. The actual min on individual sessions was as low as 500K, when the max average was 3.399. So there's a lot of volatility in terms of bandwidth, that it's changing very rapidly. So even within a 10-minute session, you're seeing basically a 240% variability on just this one control test. These were numbers we felt very confident about because we had kind of the detailed, controlled approach to this. But this is actually pretty consistent with what we see. So does packet loss play a role in this? Well, yes and no. So it was interesting. I actually started playing with some of the numbers. When you start staring at the spreadsheets long enough, you start to see all sorts of things in there. The least volatile had a 36% shift in bandwidth from the min to the max. The problem was that min started out at about 900K and only got up slightly above that. In that particular case, it went from 460K to 1.35 meg. But that only had a 0.5% packet loss associated with it. So while the two things are interconnected, there's not always a cause and effect. One of the best ones saw a variation of 336%, but its range was 2.3 to 4.3, so much more likely to be in higher resolution and not falling out of that. But was associated with slightly higher packet loss. So the problem is these things are very interdependent and very volatile, which makes it very difficult to know definitively that you're going to be able to serve high quality content on a consistent basis. Our view is, and this is kind of what our customers are telling us, is that there are places where they just know that there are difficulties serving it. It's, the two that kind of come up very often are India and Brazil. Definitely a mobile-first environment because there's so little quality wireline there. And that is how it is consumed, especially for some of the apps that our customers are serving. So we've started to break down all of this data. When we took this slice, it was a week ago today. We looked at it for the past 30 days. So this is very current data. We looked in aggregate at about 30 million sessions. In terms of unique users, a little over 2 million. So it's good statistically relevant data. And we've actually compared it, and I'll point that out as we go through, to some of the industry benchmarks like from Akamai and Cisco and Ericsson that are out there. I think we've kind of gotten to the point where the law of large numbers has taken hold on this. Worldwide cellular throughput. When we tried to do this the first time, and we did it on just a normal scale, you couldn't read anything. So we had to do it on a logarithmic scale. Right? So this is a log scale. You can see, well, that doesn't look so bad. It looks like a nice curve there. But the reality is, when you get above 12 megabits per second, you're not talking about a very large percent of the population in cellular. It's a very, very small component. We'll look at for different geographies and different network types, some of the detail behind this. But we see the same things. For Wi-Fi. A little bit better, but again, great Wi-Fi is not the norm. And in fact, we saw some interesting things in terms of error rates on Wi-Fi in countries where we wouldn't have necessarily expected it. So this one's an eye chart, so the next one is a zoom into it. So don't look too closely at that. If you register on our site, we'll send you a copy of the slides immediately as well, so you can, if you want to get in and look at this. So what we're looking at, I'm going to zoom into this. On the far left is worldwide cellular. Next to it is worldwide Wi-Fi, and then North American cellular and North American Wi-Fi. The throughput is in the green bar. So on average, on a worldwide basis, cellular, we're doing a little over 2 meg in aggregate. But with a pretty significant standard deviation of more than 3. So there's a pretty wide variation there. And that speaks to the fact that there is a lot of legacy technologies out there, 2G and 3G, that simply have difficulty delivering rich content at the level that I think those of us in the West would typically expect. When you look at Wi-Fi, obviously the throughput is significantly better, on average over 3 meg, but again, a pretty high standard deviation. When you look at North America, we're seeing cellular at just under 2 and Wi-Fi just a little over 3. These are pretty consistent with the numbers that Akamai has published on a worldwide basis. Those vary a little bit, but we feel pretty confident that we're all kind of seeing the same information coming out. We look at the standard deviation as being a way to describe kind of how broad that spectrum is. If you think of it as a bell curve, how wide the base of that is going to be spread. And that says is, there's a small amount of the time, as you saw in that logarithmic scale, where the mobile broadband infrastructure works great. We've seen that a lot in our controlled experiments. We go, yeah, we're able to accelerate a little bit, but not enough to get it from, we're already in high def, and it's not available in 4K, so it doesn't really do us any good. If there's one of the things we think of as a difference without a distinction, right? I may be able to accelerate, but does it buy me something, right? Am I getting longer session times because of that? Well, no, because there are some steps in there, especially on video and audio. So what we wanted to do is actually then kind of drill down a little bit and look at this kind of country by country in terms of the throughput. So we looked at Brazil, China, and India. You see Brazil on the left, closer to 1 meg, whereas China was closer to 2 meg. France and Singapore not surprisingly, saw very high throughput on cellular. So you see kind of a variation across the board. And we looked at the same slice in terms of Wi-Fi. A little bit higher throughput in aggregate, exactly what you would expect. So a little bit more reliable delivery. And the places you would expect, like Singapore, you see very, very good technology. You see the same kinds of things in a lot of the well-developed countries in the other studies as well. So there are some places that have great infrastructure, and other places where you go, the infrastructure is still evolving. And that makes it difficult depending on the demographic that you're trying to serve. A lot of the customers that are coming and talking to us, the conversation is around delivery in India, delivery in China, delivery in Brazil, but then also places where, like rush hour in dense urban areas, especially around mass transit, where you're going, oh, yeah, we see that it is Brazil-like at rush hour. So, I think what we're seeing is that customers are well aware of the limitations of some of this. What we're trying to do here is actually quantify this to one degree or another. So let me shift slightly and talk a little bit about packet loss. So there's two concepts. I think it's well understood that a little bit of packet loss can do damage when you're trying to stream video. On a worldwide basis, cellular sees about a 1.6% packet loss. But in an average session, that 1.6% is spread across 10.5 events on average. Right? So the question becomes, which is it better? Do you want to try to lose a lot of packets very quickly, and so you're concentrating the problem, or is it easier to recover or maintain the customer engagement if it's being spread out? Difficult to say. What you have to do is actually look deeper in to see how these kinds of things affect your session length. If you're streaming video session length, I would think is a very good proxy for your ability to monetize. Longer session times means more ads served, or people are getting through the full content. It becomes what you want to do is, I think, drive to a point where content becomes you're concerned about improving that, not just trying to get the delivery better. With Wi-Fi, we see slightly higher, but we see a much higher loss event ratio. So it's spread out a lot more. And you can kind of go down that list, and we've aggregated this. We actually tried breaking down the regions further, so we could break out Central America, South America, but then the eye chart became completely unreadable. So if you're interested, we're happy to share this data with anybody who's interested in trying to understand how to deliver within certain markets, things like that, or against certain technologies. We can even drive it down to the individual device type if we wanted to. So a couple of other things that we wanted to take a look at is, we're talking about packet loss and loss events. Average packet loss on 2G is close to 3% on average worldwide, down to about 2.5% on 3G, and just a little over 2 on 4G. When you compare that to the loss events, you say, okay, well, it's proportional in terms of the number of loss events in the average session on 2G. 3G is a little bit better, but 4G is actually a little bit worse. You're seeing lower packet loss, but spread out more. So it's a different set of challenges in terms of trying to maintain the engagement with the customer if you're seeing more of that on an ongoing basis. So this is about as deep into the weeds as we can get. So I had our data team go drill down into an individual session. So what you're seeing at the top is the actual video segment and encoding rate in terms of megabits per second. It's a little hard to see the green line, but you see it going up and down. And some of that is, as you can see, I've tried to line it up even though I didn't get the scale quite right in terms of the timestamps on this. But you can see that packet loss is actually driving the volatility in that band. There's packet loss, so everything steps back and then tries to come back up again. So these two phenomenon are intimately related. What we're seeing in this then over time is that kind of stair-step effect, which then when you average that out and start to look at it in terms of volatility, is pretty significant. And it's happening at enough frequency that it's likely to be very distracting to the person who's actually trying to view this. So that's kind of a high-level view of some of the data that we've seen. The metrics for quality of delivery, particularly for streaming media, are highly interdependent when you talk about throughput and loss. And I think the difficulty with any kind of streaming media, but particularly video, is that while with a file transfer I may think it's slow, with video I can see that it's slowing down or having problems or stalling. You see that consistently. We've also started to measure stall events and some more sophisticated metrics around that and trying to correlate those to packet loss or throughput problems as well. But the two of them are intimately related. If there's interference or contention, you're going to see the available bandwidth decrease, and in TCP, that is almost always going to lead to some element of packet loss. As it backs off, the quality degrades because of that. But similarly, if there's a problem and there's packet loss, it in turn will drive lower throughput. So there's a little bit of a chicken and the egg there within these two things. And these are probably the two most critical elements that you can actually manage and measure in terms of trying to drive quality of delivery to your customers. There's very wide variability across different network technologies. Depends what markets you're trying to serve. I mean, there is not a one-size-fits-all. You look at a lot of the different content as we're doing some of these tests. We're going, oh, well, we can't test ESPN content outside of the US because it's not available outside of the US. But we can test PBS content because it is available in certain areas. So we do see tremendous variability within those different network technologies, but even more critically within the sessions. Bandwidth on mobile broadband fundamentally is just highly variable. It is just the way that it is. And it's not something that is going to change overnight. That is something we have to live with. The result is that you have a significant demographic, the millennials and cable cutters, as well as certain demographics within countries that are mobile first that have to deal at some point or another with poor quality of delivery on mobile broadband. And the fundamental problem is that makes it harder to monetize, to maintain engagement, to minimize churn, and all of those kinds of things. So with that, I'm going to wrap up the eye charts and the tests, and happy to take any questions. And there's the URL if anybody's interested in registering to get the benchmark study when it's published mid-June. Any questions? Yes, sir.
And I stepped in late, so I'm sorry, but would you assign the largest part of the variability to the radio part of the networks versus necessarily the backhaul or the front haul?
That's our sense. I want to be clear, we have not measured that specifically because we're looking at it end to end. When I've talked to some folks about that, going, there is component in backhaul as well, but I think radio is the obvious culprit because there you're dealing with contention and interference. You're dealing with less of that. That's probably more just bottlenecks in capacity that would be more typical of what you would see on an unmanaged backbone. Again, most of this connectivity is being done before you're actually able to get to the CDN and start to take control over what's happening. So the kind of the mobile last mile, and that's a phrase I actually don't like because we've got one customer that's backhauling stuff from Asia to Virginia. So I don't know, would you talk about the mobile last 6,000 miles? Yep.
Again, I apologize, I was late. Was it predominantly about file-based, or did you talk at all about linear, and would that include like 4G, UVMS, where you can multicast?
Yes, yeah. So we can actually break it down to all the individual technologies. We just made some kind of good standard industry assumptions about what should be counted as 4G versus 3G. But we can again slice it down to any level. We have decided to err on the point of excruciating amounts of detail, and we're like everybody else. We'll make the storage guys and the database guys rich. Yes, sir. The short answer is not really. We don't look at the individual stack. We do have the device type, so we could correlate from that, but we're not directly looking at what stack was being used. Now, the exception is we do know if they were being served by a CDN, and so if it's Akamai and they're using fast TCP, we know that. We can see some of that. By the way, I should mention we have done tests against all of those different technologies, but those have been controlled lab tests, not field tests. All of the data you saw here came from production traffic. Yes, sir. Yes, we can break it down with our. I think we're actually pretty close to being able to break. We use GPS coordinates, so it's really just an issue of us how we script the slicing of the data to visualize it. So our goal is to be able to look at it on a zip code level. Right now, we're basically at a state level, but again, because it's much more likely that we'll see problems that are I'm in Massachusetts. Downtown Boston is going to see a different set of problems than the suburbs, right? So just the major metro alone probably is not enough granularity. One of our goals for our customers is to try to help them identify how, when, and where they're having the problems. We don't think it's a majority of the time, by the way. We think it's maybe 30 to 50% somewhere, that depending on the demographic you're serving. If you're exclusively serving Brazil or India, it's going to be much higher. If you're predominantly in the U.S., it's going to be on the lower end of that. But every market sees some level of that. Yes, sir.
You talk about demographics. In the U.S., are you able to go as deep as to versus the Latino group in the U.S.? What is the quality of the mobile network available to that particular demographic?
We'd have to be able to get to the zip code level, and then we'd be able to provide you that data. But to be honest, we don't have the corresponding marketing information. When I talk about the demographics, I'm generally talking about cord cutters. There's a general perception that it's heavily skewed towards millennials who want to be able to watch it on their mobile devices when and where they choose. They're not attuned to broadcast TV. But there are services that databases out there where you could very easily say, here are zip codes that are predominantly of all sorts of different slices, so you'd be able to correlate that actually pretty easily. I should say that we do make any of this data available to our customers either through our portal or through an API, so you can suck it in any data management system or application performance management system you want. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, there's something going by. Yeah, that's something that we're looking at in the benchmarking study right now. Is you're talking about, if I heard the question entirely, is you kind of effectively talking. Yeah. So what is the relative utilization levels or efficiency that you're able to gain? Yeah, because we can correlate that against some of the deep information we have about the networks that they're actually running on. Yeah, so we'd be able to at least approximate that with the data that we've got. Anybody else? All right, well, thanks very much. If you register there, we'll send you a copy of the slides so that You can actually see what I was talking about, and we'll be happy to send you a copy of the benchmark study as soon as it's published. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.